The forest stretched out before them, its towering pines casting long, jagged shadows across the overgrown path. Jared wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing nervously at the two people standing beside him. The air was thick, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets, secrets tied to the rotting, decaying cabin that stood in the distance. "You sure this is a good idea?" Jared muttered, his voice barely audible over the whispering wind. Taylor, always the instigator, grinned back at him. "Good idea? Number. That's why it's gonna be fun." Fun. Jared didn't like the way Taylor said it. He knew his friend well enough to recognize when his bravado was hiding something darker, something desperate to prove. Taylor thrived on these kinds of challenges. Ever since they were kids, Taylor had been the one to push the limits, daring everyone to do the things that seemed impossible or stupid. And this was definitely stupid. The third member of their group, Emily, stood silently, arms crossed. Her face was set, her eyes fixed on the cabin like she was trying to stare it into submission. She was the practical one, the one who usually talked them out of doing idiotic things like this. But tonight, something about her was different. Jared couldn't tell if it was determination or defiance, but whatever it wasn't giving her pause. The cabin loomed ahead, a relic of forgotten times. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and the windows, black and gaping, resembled hollow eyes that watched their every move. The stories about this place, everyone in town had heard them. Some said the cabin was cursed, others claimed it was haunted. But the scariest stories were the ones where people entered and never came back. "All right, here's the deal," Taylor said, breaking the silence. "We go inside, spend 1 hour, and then we get the hell out. Simple, nothing to it." Jared swallowed hard, staring up at the sinister structure. The longer he looked, the less it seemed like an abandoned cabin and more like a trap. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying a distant, hollow sound, like someone or something was whispering their names. "Why are we doing this again?" Jared asked, his voice shaky. "Because," Taylor shot back, eyes gleaming with excitement, "it's the last night before we all go our separate ways. One last adventure. We need this." Emily finally spoke, her voice low and even. "It's not about needing it. It's about proving it. The cabin's just wood and nails. We're going to walk in, look around, and then leave. No ghosts, no demons." No one seemed convinced, least of all Emily. They approached the front steps, which groaned under their weight, brittle and ready to collapse. Jared hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. For a brief second, something in his mind screamed at him to turn back, to walk away. But Taylor was already pushing the door open with a loud creak, and that opportunity was gone. The smell hit them immediately, musty, damp, the unmistakable scent of rot. Dust swirled in the faint beams of sunlight that filtered through the shattered windows. The cabin had been untouched for decades, and yet there was a strange feeling that permeated the air, a sense that they were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. "See," Taylor said, walking in first. "Just an old cabin." But his confidence didn't extend far. Jared could see it in the way Taylor's eyes darted nervously around the room, and the way his steps slowed as they moved further inside. Emily stayed close to the doorway, looking back over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to be watching them from the woods. Jared stayed behind her, his heart pounding in his chest. The oppressive silence was the worst part. There was no creak of the floorboards under their weight, no rustle of leaves in the wind, no chirping of crickets. Nothing. Just silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "All right, we're here," Emily said, arms still crossed. "Now what?" Before anyone could answer, there was a sudden, sharp sound from upstairs, a loud thump that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. They froze. "What? What was that?" Jared asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Taylor forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Probably just something falling over. This place is ancient." But even Taylor's bravado couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. "Let's just go," Jared said, his pulse racing. "We've been inside. That's enough, right?" But the cabin wasn't letting them leave. The air around them seemed heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on their shoulders, making it harder to move. Emily stepped toward the door, but it swung shut on its own with a deafening creak, the noise reverberating through the small space. They stared at the door in stunned silence. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Old houses," Taylor muttered, though his hands were trembling. "They settle, doors swing." But none of them believed that. A faint sound, like footsteps, drifted down the hallway just beyond the staircase. Jared's mouth went dry, his heart pounding against his ribs. "We need to leave," Jared insisted, moving toward the door. He pulled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His palms were slick with sweat, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "We just need to check upstairs," Taylor said, though it was clear he didn't want to. "Once we do that, we're done. Prove it's just some old house." Jared wanted to protest, but Emily had already moved toward the staircase, her flashlight flickering as she ascended. There was no turning back. Not anymore. With one last glance at the door, still tightly shut, Jared followed them into the growing darkness, the cabin creaking and groaning around them like a living, breathing thing. As they climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them at the top. Something that didn't want them to leave. And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't. The stairs groaned beneath their feet, each step slower than the last. Emily led the way, her flashlight casting trembling beams of light ahead, illuminating fragments of the dilapidated second floor. The hallway stretched out before them, cloaked in shadows, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing moment. Jared was last, his heart pounding in his chest, the eerie silence of the cabin amplifying every breath, every soft creak of the wood beneath his weight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something lurking just beyond the reach of their lights, hidden in the darkened corners of the house. The oppressive silence was too much. His nerves were unraveling with every step. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, stopping mid-step. Jared's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard anything, but the fear in her voice was enough to send shivers down his spine. They all froze, listening intently. A faint noise echoed from one of the rooms ahead, soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was followed by a slow, deliberate creaking sound, as if something heavy was shifting its weight. Jared leaned closer to Taylor. "This isn't right, man. I say we go back. Now." Taylor didn't respond. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes were stubborn, focused. He wasn't about to back down, not after everything they'd heard about the cabin. The rumors, the dare. It all felt too much like a challenge, one he couldn't walk away from. "Just one more look around," Taylor said, though his voice was quieter now, lacking the bravado from earlier. He was scared, Jared could tell, but pride had him locked into this. Emily took another cautious step forward, her flashlight flickering like it was struggling to stay lit. The hallway felt endless, a tunnel leading deeper into something unknown, something darker than any of them could have anticipated. They stopped at the first room on the left. The door was slightly ajar, as though someone had been inside recently, or was still inside. Emily hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open with a creak. It was a bedroom, or at least it had been once. The bed, sagging under the weight of age, sat in the center, its sheets gray with dust. A broken mirror hung crooked on the far wall, the glass cracked and filthy. A wardrobe, its doors hanging open, stood in the corner like a forgotten sentinel. Jared ran a shaky hand along the wall, feeling the dampness, the cold that seeped into his bones. "This place is seriously messed up," he muttered under his breath. Taylor was already moving further into the room, scanning the space with his phone's flashlight. "See?" he said, though his voice lacked the cockiness it had before. "Nothing but an old house. Nothing here to be scared of." Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The door slammed shut behind them, shaking the walls with the force of the impact. Emily screamed, spinning toward the door, her flashlight flickering madly as she tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, her knuckles white, but it was as though the door had fused with the frame, locking them inside. "Open it!" Jared shouted, rushing to her side, his hands fumbling with the door handle. But no matter how hard they pulled, the door remained stubbornly closed. "This can't be happening," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "This can't be real." Before they could process what was happening, the temperature in the room dropped. A biting cold crept up from the floorboards, chilling them to the core. Jared shivered, his breath fogging in front of him. Then it came. The voice. A low, guttural whisper, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. It slithered through the room like an icy wind, curling around them, suffocating them with its presence. "You shouldn't have come here." Jared's stomach lurched. He backed away from the door, eyes wide, scanning the room for any sign of who or what had spoken. But there was nothing. No one. Only the cold and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Emily's breath hitched, her wide eyes darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. What was that? Taylor stood frozen, his back against the wall. His confidence had crumbled completely, leaving only fear in its place. "Who said that?" he demanded, though his voice cracked with terror. But the room had fallen silent again. For a long moment, no one moved. No one dared to speak. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper. It felt like the room was shrinking around them, the walls pressing closer, suffocating them. And then, without warning, the bed shifted. A low, groaning creak cut through the silence as the old mattress dipped under an invisible weight, as though someone, or something, was sitting down. Jared's heart skipped a beat. His skin prickled with cold sweat, every hair standing on end. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, stepping back until her shoulder hit the door. The bed creaked again, deeper this time, the mattress sinking further. There was no one there, no physical presence, but the air in the room had changed, grown heavier, like they weren't alone anymore. "Open the door," Jared hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get it open now." "I'm trying," Emily cried, frantically tugging at the handle, but the door remained locked, sealing them in with whatever had just joined them. Jared couldn't take it anymore. His heart was racing, his mind screaming at him to run, to to escape. The room was too cold, too quiet, except for the rhythmic creak of the bed, rising and falling like the breathing of something unseen. Suddenly, the mirror on the far wall cracked with a sharp snap. A web of fractures spread across its surface, distorting their reflections into something twisted and grotesque. Jared's own reflection seemed to sneer at him, eyes dark and hollow, lips curled in a mockery of fear. Then, from the shadows, came another whisper. "Leave, while you still can." The voice was clearer now, closer, as if someone was standing right behind them. Jared's skin crawled and he turned to look over his shoulder, but no one was there. Nothing but the cold, empty air. Finally, with a jarring click, the door swung open on its own. Emily stumbled back, her face pale, her hands shaking as she stared at the now open doorway. Jared didn't need any more convincing. He grabbed Taylor's arm and bolted out into the hallway, Emily right behind him. But even as they ran down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence, Jared knew something was wrong. The house wasn't done with them. They reached the bottom of the stairs, gasping for breath, hearts pounding, but the front door, their only way out, was still closed. Jared grabbed the knob, pulling hard, but it wouldn't move. It was stuck, just like the bedroom door had been. And then from somewhere deep inside the house, a door creaked open. Jared's blood ran cold. The house was alive. It was watching them. And it was waiting for its next move. The front door stood resolutely shut, as if it had become an extension of the cabin's will, trapping them inside. Jared's hands slipped from the cold metal doorknob as he sank to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Emily, pale and shaking, leaned against the wall, her eyes darting to the stairs as though she expected something, or someone, to come creeping down at any moment. Taylor paced, hands in his hair, muttering curses under his breath. "Why won't it let us out?" Emily's voice was tight with fear, her eyes wide. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jared tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his mind was spinning. It felt as though the cabin itself was alive, a sentient thing that had wrapped its cold, malevolent tendrils around them. His thoughts drifted back to the stories, the rumors they had all heard growing up, whispered on the playground or around campfires, stories about the Drayton cabin. He remembered them now more vividly than ever. "This place," Jared started, his voice hoarse, "it's not just some random abandoned house. You guys remember the stories, right?" Emily and Taylor looked at him, confused. "The Draytons," Jared continued, "the family that lived here before everything went to hell. My grandfather used to tell me about them when I was a kid. Said this place was cursed, that no one should ever come near it." Taylor scoffed, though it was half-hearted. "Cursed? That's just some urban legend crap. This place isn't cursed, Jared. It's just old." But even as Taylor said it, his voice cracked with uncertainty. Jared could see the doubt creeping into his friend's eyes. Emily, always the more pragmatic one, knelt beside Jared. "Tell me what you remember. If there's something about this place we don't know, maybe it can help us get out." Jared took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. The Draytons. They were the last family to live here, back in the 1920s or something. The father, Andrew Drayton, was some kind of recluse, kept to himself, his wife, and their 2 kids. No one in town saw them much. The few people who did said they were strange. Something was off about them, like they didn't belong. My grandfather said they used to hear voices, things no one else could hear. Emily shifted uncomfortably. And then what? Jared glanced at the door, almost expecting it to move, as if the cabin was listening. One night, they just vanished. No one knows what happened to them. They didn't take anything with them. No note, no sign of a struggle. It was like they were here 1 minute, and the next, they were gone. The cops searched the place, but nothing was ever found. No bodies, nothing. Just emptiness. He paused, his eyes flicking nervously to the shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. People started saying the cabin was haunted, that whatever took the Draytons was still here, waiting for anyone dumb enough to come inside. Taylor snorted, though he didn't seem as sure of himself anymore. Ghost stories, that's all this is. Jared shook his head. It's not just that. I remember my grandfather telling me that after the Draytons disappeared, a few people came out here to investigate. Journalists, some locals. They wanted to know what happened. Most of them never came back, and the ones who did, they weren't the same. Their minds were broken. One guy, Harold Flynn, ended up in the psych ward, rambling about voices, shadows, something about the walls. The walls? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jared nodded. Yeah. He said they spoke to him, said they whispered things, dark things, secrets no one should know. That's when people started talking about the curse. Some believed the Draytons did something, some kind of ritual or, I don't know, but whatever it was, it brought something into the house, and it never left. Taylor's pacing slowed, his steps heavy. So you're telling me this place is cursed because a family disappeared almost 100 years ago? Not just that, Jared said, his voice low, urgent. Everyone who came here after, who thought it was just an old story, they paid for it. No one gets out of this place, not really. The temperature in the room dropped again, the chill gnawing at their skin. Emily's breath fogged in front of her as she pulled her jacket tighter around her. There has to be something we can do, she said, her voice barely holding steady. Something they missed. People can't just vanish. But even as she spoke, a cold realization settled over them all. The stories weren't just legends. The cabin was different, darker than any of them had imagined. It wasn't just a house, it was a prison, and they were the latest in a long line of victims. Suddenly, from the far corner of the room, came a low, scraping noise. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew louder, the sound of something dragging across the floorboards, slow and deliberate. Emily's head snapped toward the noise. What was that? Jared's blood ran cold. He remembered his grandfather's words. The walls are alive. They know when you're afraid. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. Jared felt his pulse quicken, the panic rising in his chest. I think it knows we're here, he whispered. Taylor shook his head, though he didn't sound convinced. Don't say that. Don't start. Then came the whisper, the same voice they had heard upstairs, curling around them like a freezing wind. It knows, and it's hungry. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, coming from the walls, from the floors, from the very air around them. Jared felt a chill creep up his spine, his eyes flicking around the room. But there was nothing. No figure, no ghost. Just the cabin and the overwhelming sense that it was watching them, calculating their every move. Emily pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. What is it? What does it want? Jared swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I don't know," he admitted, voice shaking. "But I think it wants us to stay, like the Draytons." The room felt smaller now, the walls seeming to close in, as if the cabin itself was tightening its grip on them. The shadows swirled, darker and more oppressive, and beneath the floorboards, deep within the house, came a low, guttural sound, like something alive, waiting. Taylor finally broke. "We can't stay here," he shouted, rushing toward the window. He tried to pry it open, his fingers scraping at the old wood, but it was no use. The window wouldn't budge, as though it, too, was part of the cabin's twisted game. Emily stood frozen, her face pale, eyes wide with panic. "What do we do?" Jared's mind raced, but no answers came. The stories, the history, it was all leading to one thing. They were trapped. The Draytons hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken, swallowed by whatever darkness lurked within the house. And now, it was their turn. Jared took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the door at the far end of the hallway, the door that had led to the upstairs rooms, the place where they had first heard the voices. "We have to find out what happened to them," he said, his voice shaking. "If we figure out what the Draytons did, maybe we can stop it." Taylor's face twisted in disbelief. "Stop it? You think we can fight a haunted house?" Jared didn't know if they could, but there was no other choice. Whatever haunted this cabin, whatever dark force had consumed the Draytons and everyone else who had stepped inside, it was coming for them, and time was running out. The floorboards creaked beneath them as they stood at the base of the stairs, breathing hard, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The front door loomed ahead, but it felt impossibly far away, as though the house itself was stretching the space between them and freedom. The air was thick, suffocating, and each step they took seemed to carry the weight of the cabin's sinister intent. Emily was the first to move, her breath ragged as she stumbled toward the door, her hand outstretched. "We have to get out," she muttered, her voice trembling with desperation. "We have to go now." But Jared wasn't so sure anymore. His feet felt like lead, frozen in place as the cold realization settled over him. The cabin didn't want them to leave. It had been toying with them, teasing them with glimpses of escape, only to pull them deeper into its clutches. The whispers, the voices, the flickering shadows. They were all part of its trap, luring them into a false sense of hope. Behind him, Taylor stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide with the same dawning horror that was gripping Jared. "This is it, isn't it?" Taylor whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're not getting out." Jared swallowed hard, fighting the panic rising in his throat. "Don't say that. We just have to keep trying." But the words felt hollow, even to him. Emily reached the door, her fingers curling around the cold brass knob. She twisted it, yanking hard, but the door didn't budge. Her breath hitched and she pulled again, harder this time, throwing her weight against it. The door remained sealed, as if it were part of the cabin's twisted flesh. "Open!" she screamed, pounding on the wood with both fists. "Open! Damn it!" The door didn't move. Jared rushed to her side, his heart racing as he pulled at the knob, but it was like trying to move a mountain. He could feel the weight of the house pressing against it, against them, holding them in place. Taylor joined them, pushing and pulling, their combined efforts growing more frantic with each passing second, but it was useless. The cabin had made its decision. It wasn't letting them go. Jared stepped back, his hands trembling, eyes wide with terror. His pulse pounded in his ears as the walls around them seemed to swell and contract like the cabin was breathing, alive, watching, waiting. Emily collapsed against the door, tears streaming down her face. "It won't let us out," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're never getting out." Jared felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of her words crushing him. For a moment, he could only stare at the door, at the flickering shadows that moved just beyond the windows, teasing them with the illusion of freedom. He could see the outside world, so close, yet impossibly far. Behind them, a soft creaking sound echoed through the house. Jared turned slowly, his blood running cold. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the upstairs rooms, was slowly swinging open. It creaked as it moved, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, grating against their already frayed nerves. Beyond it was nothing but darkness, thick and impenetrable, but there was something in that darkness, something that had been waiting for them all along. Emily gasped, stumbling away from the door. What is that?" Jared's mouth went dry. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. But he could feel it, a presence, a weight that filled the room, suffocating them with its malevolent intent. The shadows that had been swirling around them seemed to gather, coalescing into something more, something tangible. Suddenly, the cabin shook. A deep, guttural noise reverberated through the walls, like the growl of a beast waking from a long slumber. The air grew colder, and the very structure of the house seemed to warp and twist, as though reality itself was bending to the will of whatever had taken root here. Jared's heart raced as he backed away from the stairs, pulling Emily with him. Taylor stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the growing darkness beyond the open door. "Don't go near it," Jared whispered, though the words barely seemed to reach his own ears. "Don't." But it was too late. The shadows shifted again, and from the inky blackness of the open door, something emerged. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was a twisted, grotesque figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its face distorted into something monstrous, its eyes hollow and black. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Emily screamed, her voice piercing the heavy silence. Jared grabbed her arm, yanking her back toward the door, but the creature was faster than it should have been. It moved in a series of rapid, twitching motions, closing the distance between them in seconds. "We have to go," Jared shouted, his voice raw with fear. "Now!" Taylor turned and bolted toward the nearest window, his fists hammering against the glass. It didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. The cabin wasn't giving them an inch. It was toying with them, drawing out their terror like a predator savoring its prey. The creature drew closer, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. Jared backed into the door, pulling Emily behind him. "There has to be a way out," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, but nothing came. The walls were closing in, the darkness swallowing them whole. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was the end. Then, as if in response to his panic, the cabin shifted again. The ceiling above them groaned, the beams twisting and warping, the walls vibrating with an eerie, otherworldly energy. The door they had tried so desperately to open finally gave way, creaking open just an inch. A flicker of hope surged through Jared. "The door!" he shouted. "It's open! Go!" Emily didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the gap, pulling it open just enough to squeeze through. Taylor followed, his eyes wide with terror, his body shaking as he pushed past Jared. But Jared hesitated. His eyes flicked back to the hallway, to the thing that was watching them. It had stopped moving, its head tilted to one side as if waiting for something, its grin wide and grotesque. It didn't want them to leave. Jared's stomach twisted with dread. He knew deep down that it was letting them go, for now. But the cabin would never truly let them leave. Not completely. With one last glance at the creature, Jared slipped through the door and slammed it shut behind him. The cold night air hit him like a shock, but it was a relief. The forest loomed before them, dark and foreboding, but at least they were outside. At least they were free. Emily gasped for breath beside him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We're out. We actually made it." Jared didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the cabin, watching as the darkness in the windows seemed to pulse, as if the house was still watching them, still waiting. Taylor, pale and shaking, spoke first. "We need to leave, right now." But Jared couldn't move. His feet were planted in the earth, his eyes drawn to the front door of the cabin, which had slowly creaked open once again. The darkness inside seemed to ripple, and in the distance, just beyond the threshold, he thought he saw the faintest hint of movement. It was calling them back. The house wasn't done with them. And as they turned and ran into the night, Jared knew, deep down, that no matter how far they got, no matter where they went, the cabin would always be there, watching, waiting. It was only a matter of time.